New developments in the legal battle surrounding Blake Lively, Stephanie Jones, and Justin Baldoni are quickly drawing intense scrutiny, and one specific court development is now raising far bigger questions than anyone expected. Because behind the headlines, a judge's ruling tied to the dispute involving Wayfarer Studios, Jones Works, and publicist Jen Abel has quietly introduced a possibility that could reshape the entire narrative surrounding this case. Many observers initially believed the story was centered on a PR war and media narratives, accusations of a smear campaign, claims about behind-the-scenes conflicts connected to It Ends With Us, and a widening feud that pulled in figures like Ryan Reynolds, Leslie Sloan, and even references to Taylor Swift. But what's now emerging in the court filings is something very different. At the center of the controversy is an allegation that data from Jen Abel's phone may have been accessed and distributed without authorization, potentially triggering claims under California Penal Code 502, a statute focused on unauthorized access to computer data. And according to developments in the litigation involving Wayfarer Studios, Jones Works, and the broader Van Zandt lawsuit, a federal judge has already indicated that the allegations surrounding that access were plausibly pled, meaning the claims were strong enough to survive early dismissal and potentially move toward trial. That single development changes the stakes, because if the court ultimately determines that confidential information, internal communications, or private messages were accessed and then shared with outside parties, including figures connected to Blake Lively or Ryan Reynolds, it could open the door to a cascade of breach of contract claims, financial damages, and reputational fallout. And this is where the situation begins to escalate, because several filings now suggest that the battle unfolding in court may not just determine who controlled the narrative, but whether the actions taken behind the scenes could trigger serious legal and financial consequences. Many viewers following the case have begun asking the same question. Was this simply a public relations battle, or did something happen behind the scenes that now places multiple people under legal scrutiny? And as the filings continue to surface, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. This story may be far from over. In fact, according to the timeline emerging from the litigation, the most consequential developments may still be ahead. But to understand why the situation involving Blake Lively, Stephanie Jones, and Justin Baldoni is now attracting this level of legal scrutiny, it helps to rewind to the moment when the dispute first began drawing public attention. Because what initially appeared to be a routine Hollywood dispute tied to the production of It Ends With Us gradually evolved into something much larger, a conflict involving Wayfarer Studios, a prominent public relations firm called Jones Works, and a series of allegations connected to the handling of confidential information. At the center of that early conflict was Jen Abel, a publicist who had worked within the orbit of Jones Works and whose communications later became a key focus in the broader litigation. According to filings referenced throughout the case, tensions escalated when disputes began forming between Wayfarer Studios, Justin Baldoni, and individuals connected to Jones Works, the firm led by Stephanie Jones. Many observers initially believed the conflict was primarily about public narrative control, specifically allegations that a smear campaign had been orchestrated behind the scenes in anticipation of potential public accusations tied to the production of It Ends With Us. That narrative gained traction after reporting from outlets like The New York Times and The Hollywood Reporter, which referenced the idea that a coordinated effort might have existed to shape media coverage surrounding the dispute. But as more filings surfaced, the focus began shifting away from media strategy and toward something much more technical. Court filings connected to the dispute began referencing the contents of Jen Abel's phone, including communications that allegedly circulated among individuals connected to Jones Works and eventually reached outside parties. And this is where the situation becomes more complicated, because the legal dispute now centers on how that information was obtained, who accessed it, and whether the access was authorized under the law. According to the claims discussed in the litigation, Jen Abel alleged that data associated with her phone, including communications connected to her work, may have been accessed through her iCloud account after her departure from JonesWorks. Those allegations quickly introduced potential issues involving unauthorized access to digital data, something that falls directly under the scope of California Penal Code 502. And once those claims entered the legal record, the nature of the dispute changed dramatically. Because instead of a disagreement over public relations strategy, the conflict now involved questions about data access, client confidentiality, and whether communications connected to Wayfarer Studios may have been circulated outside of their intended channels. That shift is what ultimately pulled Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and other figures into the legal conversation. And according to multiple filings, determining how the information moved from a private phone to outside parties has now become one of the central issues in the litigation. But this is where the situation escalates even further, because the next development in the case came not from media reports, but directly from the courtroom. But the moment that truly shifted the trajectory of this dispute didn't come from media coverage or public statements. It came from a court ruling. Because as the litigation between Jen Abel, Stephanie Jones, JonesWorks, and Wayfarer Studios progressed, one of the earliest legal battles centered on a motion to dismiss, a request asking the court to throw out certain claims before the case could move forward. And this is where the legal stakes began to change. When Judge Louis Lyman reviewed the filings connected to Jen Abel's claims, one particular issue immediately stood out: whether the allegations involving access to her phone could support a claim under California Penal Code 502, a statute addressing unauthorized access to computer systems or digital data. According to the ruling, the court determined that Jen Abel had plausibly alleged that her phone data may have been accessed without permission. That distinction is important. At this stage of litigation, the judge was not determining guilt or liability. Instead, the court was evaluating whether the claims were legally sufficient to proceed. And in that evaluation, the court concluded that the allegations, including claims involving access to messages, communications, and other data associated with Abel's device and iCloud account, could support a claim under California Penal Code 502. In other words, the court determined that the allegations were strong enough to remain part of the case. For many legal observers following the dispute, that moment represented a turning point. Because if a court allows claims involving unauthorized data access to proceed, the next phase of litigation often involves discovery, where parties may seek documents, communications, and testimony related to the disputed events. And discovery can significantly expand the scope of what becomes visible inside a case. Court filings referenced in the dispute also describe a key issue surrounding the timeline of events, specifically whether the data associated with Jen Abel's phone was accessed before any subpoena or legal process existed. That distinction matters, because if data connected to Wayfarer Studios or its communications was accessed and circulated without a subpoena or legal authorization, it could potentially raise questions involving confidential information, client communications, and the contractual obligations tied to JonesWorks' relationship with Wayfarer Studios. And that's where the next layer of the case begins to emerge. Because the dispute is no longer limited to the question of phone access. It now intersects with a much broader issue: whether the handling of that information may have triggered breach of contract claims tied to the professional relationship between Wayfarer Studios and JonesWorks. And that development has the potential to introduce significant financial and reputational stakes into the litigation. But the situation escalates even further once the contractual side of the dispute enters the picture, because the agreements between Wayfarer Studios and JonesWorks contained very specific provisions about confidential information, and those provisions now sit directly at the center of the legal fight. But this is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Because once the court allowed the claims involving Jen Abel's phone to proceed, the focus shifted to a much more specific question: how the data from that device may have been accessed and circulated in the first place. And according to the allegations discussed in the litigation, the answer may involve the internal handling of that device after Jen Abel's departure from JonesWorks. Court filings referenced in the dispute describe a scenario in which Jen Abel allegedly provided access to her phone temporarily for a limited administrative purpose, specifically to assist with the transfer of her phone number connected to work communications. But the allegations state that the access to the device may have continued beyond that limited purpose. According to the claims raised in the case, individuals associated with JonesWorks, the firm led by Stephanie Jones, may have retained access to the device through Abel's iCloud account or other means after the initial transition process was completed. That detail quickly became central to the legal argument, because under California Penal Code 502, the key issue is not simply whether someone had physical access to a device. The question is whether the data on that device was accessed knowingly and without authorization. And according to the allegations referenced by the court, the claims assert that messages and communications stored on the phone may have been accessed and circulated internally within JonesWorks. Some of those communications, according to the filings, allegedly included conversations connected to Wayfarer Studios, the production company linked to Justin Baldoni and the film It Ends With Us. This is where the legal tension intensifies, because if communications tied to Wayfarer Studios were accessed and then shared outside their intended channels, it introduces a second layer of potential legal exposure. Not just unauthorized access, but the possible dissemination of confidential client information. And according to allegations described in the litigation, some of that information may have eventually reached individuals outside the original professional relationship, including figures connected to Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds. Again, these are allegations being examined through the court process, not findings of liability. But the legal implications are significant, because if confidential communications tied to Wayfarer Studios were accessed from Jen Abel's phone and then shared with outside parties, it could intersect directly with the contractual obligations that governed the relationship between JonesWorks and its client. And that is the point where the dispute moves beyond a question of phone access and into something far more serious: potential contractual breaches. Because the agreement between Wayfarer Studios and JonesWorks reportedly included very specific provisions about the handling of confidential information. And according to filings discussed in the case, those provisions are now being tested inside the courtroom, which leads directly to the next escalation, because the contractual obligations at the center of this relationship may carry significant financial consequences if a breach is ultimately established. But once the discussion moves from phone access to contract obligations, the stakes change again. Because the dispute between Wayfarer Studios and JonesWorks is not just about who accessed Jen Abel's phone. It's about whether the handling of that information violated the confidentiality provisions inside a professional services agreement. According to filings referenced in the litigation, Wayfarer Studios had an agreement with JonesWorks, the public relations firm led by Stephanie Jones, to provide strategic communications and public relations services. Like many agreements between companies and their PR firms, the contract reportedly included clear rules about the handling of confidential information. Those provisions typically require a firm to protect sensitive communications connected to its client, including internal discussions, private messages, and any information shared during the course of the professional relationship. And according to the claims raised in the case, Wayfarer Studios alleges that those obligations may have been violated. Specifically, the filings reference allegations that confidential communications associated with Wayfarer Studios were accessed from Jen Abel's phone and then shared with third parties outside the original client relationship. Among the individuals mentioned in the broader dispute are Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and Leslie Sloan, all of whom were connected in various ways to the unfolding media narrative surrounding the production of It Ends With Us. Again, these are allegations under examination through the court process, but if the court ultimately determines that Jones Works accessed and shared confidential information connected to its client without proper authorization, the consequences could extend beyond the original claims involving California Penal Code 502, because that scenario could potentially support claims involving breach of contract. In the filings discussed in the case, Wayfarer Studios reportedly raised several legal theories connected to this issue, including breach of contract and breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. Both claims revolve around the same fundamental question: whether the firm entrusted with protecting client communications may have used or shared those communications in a way that conflicted with its contractual obligations. And if a court ultimately finds that those obligations were violated, it could open the door to claims involving financial damages, potentially tied to the impact those disclosures had on the client relationship. This is where the potential financial consequences mentioned in headlines and commentary begin to enter the discussion, because breach of contract cases involving confidential information can sometimes lead to claims for monetary damages, depending on how the court evaluates the scope of the alleged breach. And this is precisely why the next phase of the litigation becomes so important. Because once allegations involving unauthorized access, confidential information, and contractual obligations all converge in the same case, the legal strategy often shifts dramatically. And according to several filings, that shift may already be underway. But while the courtroom battle over unauthorized access, confidential information, and potential breach of contract continues to unfold, another fight has been playing out in parallel: a fight over the public narrative. Because from the beginning of the dispute involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, Wayfarer Studios, and Jones Works, media coverage quickly became a central part of the story. Reports referencing a possible smear campaign circulated widely, particularly in coverage connected to outlets such as the New York Times and the Hollywood Reporter. Those reports focused heavily on the idea that individuals connected to Wayfarer Studios may have anticipated public allegations tied to the production of It Ends With Us, and that steps were allegedly taken to prepare for potential reputational fallout. But as the legal filings continued to expand, some observers began noting that the litigation was increasingly introducing new claims and counterclaims that complicated the original narrative. One example involves claims raised in connection with individuals such as Melissa Nathan, a crisis communications professional who has been mentioned in filings and commentary related to the case. In some accounts circulating online, Melissa Nathan has been accused by various parties of operating or coordinating websites critical of individuals involved in the dispute. However, those allegations remain part of the broader public controversy, rather than findings established through the court process. At the same time, the litigation has also referenced figures such as Brian Friedman, a well-known attorney who has represented clients in several high-profile disputes connected to the entertainment industry. The appearance of multiple attorneys, consultants, and media narratives has made the situation increasingly complex. Because alongside the legal claims involving Jen Abel's phone, California Penal Code 502, and the contractual dispute between Wayfarer Studios and Jones Works, the public conversation has continued to revolve around questions of reputation, media coverage, and narrative control. Many viewers following the story noticed that as more court filings, motions, and legal arguments entered the record, the tone of some media coverage began to shift. Headlines began referencing tensions on the set of It Ends With Us, internal disputes tied to Wayfarer Studios, and allegations involving figures such as Ryan Reynolds. But none of those public narratives ultimately determined the outcome of the case, because the final decisions will come from the courtroom, not the media cycle. And this is why the next phase of the litigation may prove to be the most consequential, because as the court continues reviewing the claims tied to unauthorized data access, contractual obligations, and confidential information, the legal process could eventually produce rulings that reshape the entire dispute. And if that happens, the conversations surrounding Blake Lively, Stephanie Jones, and Wayfarer Studios may change once again. And this is where the situation begins to tighten even further. Because as the dispute involving Wayfarer Studios, JonesWorks, Stephanie Jones, and Jen Abel continues moving through the legal system, the next major stage of the process could determine how serious the consequences might become. At the center of the litigation are several overlapping legal questions. First, whether the allegations involving unauthorized access to Jen Abel's phone, including claims tied to California Penal Code 502, ultimately withstand the full scrutiny of the court. Second, whether any communications connected to Wayfarer Studios that were obtained from that device qualify as confidential information under the contractual relationship between Wayfarer Studios and JonesWorks. And third, whether the handling of those communications could support the breach of contract and breach of the implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing claims that have been referenced in filings tied to the dispute. Each of these issues could carry significant implications, because if the court determines that confidential client information associated with Wayfarer Studios was accessed or shared in a way that violated contractual obligations, it could open the door to claims involving financial damages. Those damages would not be determined by headlines or speculation. They would be evaluated through the legal process, based on evidence, testimony, and the interpretation of the agreement between Wayfarer Studios and JonesWorks. And that process may take time. Litigation involving multiple parties, motions, counterclaims, and discovery disputes often unfolds gradually, but several observers following the filings have noted that the case has already reached an important threshold. Because when the court allowed the claims tied to California Penal Code 502 to proceed past the early motion to dismiss stage, it meant the allegations surrounding Jen Abel's phone were serious enough to remain part of the litigation. And that development alone may shape the trajectory of the case moving forward. It also explains why the legal strategies on both sides appear to be evolving. New filings, additional claims, and procedural motions have continued appearing on the docket as each party attempts to position itself ahead of the next stage of the litigation. For viewers following the dispute involving Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, Stephanie Jones, and Wayfarer Studios, the most significant developments may ultimately come from the court itself. Because once the legal process advances further, whether through additional rulings, discovery disclosures, or potential trial proceedings, the facts established inside the courtroom may carry far greater weight than the narratives circulating outside it. And that is the point where the outcome of the dispute could finally begin to take shape. And as this dispute involving Blake Lively, Stephanie Jones, Justin Baldoni, Wayfarer Studios, JonesWorks, and Jen Abel continues to move through the legal process, the most consequential developments may still lie ahead, because the questions now in front of the court are not small ones. They involve allegations tied to California Penal Code 502, claims of unauthorized access to Jen Abel's phone, the handling of confidential information, and whether the professional relationship between Wayfarer Studios and JonesWorks complied with its contractual obligations. Each of those issues carries potential implications that extend beyond the individuals involved. If the litigation ultimately establishes that client communications or confidential data were accessed or circulated improperly, the case could become a significant example of how courts evaluate digital data access, professional confidentiality, and public relations relationships in the modern media environment. At the same time, observers following the situation have noticed how quickly the public narrative surrounding Blake Lively, Justin Baldoni, and the production of It Ends With Us has shifted as new court filings, motions, and legal arguments have surfaced. But the ultimate direction of the story will not be determined by headlines or speculation. It will be determined by the evidence examined through the courtroom process. And as that process continues, through additional rulings, potential discovery disclosures, and further legal arguments, more details connected to the dispute between Wayfarer Studios, Jones Works, and Jen Abel may become part of the public record. Many viewers following the case are now watching closely to see what happens next, because if additional rulings or evidence emerge, the legal landscape surrounding this dispute could shift again. So the question now becomes, what developments will appear next on the court docket, and how might they reshape the broader story surrounding Blake Lively, Stephanie Jones, and Justin Baldoni? If you're following this case and want updates as new court filings and legal developments emerge, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share your thoughts in the comments. Because as this legal battle continues to unfold, there may still be several chapters left in the story.